Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Otoma Edje. I'm very excited today to have with us Dr. John Fee, who is a distinguished professor of American history at Messiah University. He is the author of 6 books, and the most recent one from 2018 is Believe Me, and we're going to talk about that today. This kind of came about primarily because the world seems like it's lost its mind. And, we know right now with everything going on at the Capitol, January 6th, there's a certain reason why this happened. And so the title for our little time together is How Did We Get Here? So again, this is Image Bearers, Season 3, Episode 2. So again, welcome to the program, Dr. Fee.
Hey, thanks for having me, Otoma.
Good deal. So I think to properly understand the politics of some of the evangelicals that we see on the media and so forth, it's helpful for us to be aware of their fears, okay? And you use the first 3 chapters of your book to expound on some of their fears. Can you please explain some of those fears and how they drive their politics?
Sure. I think at the heart of this is a larger umbrella fear that all the other ones sort of sit under, and that is fear of social and demographic change. And that could be taken in a variety of different ways. For many white evangelicals, again, most of these, the so-called 81%, if the statistic is correct, that voted for Donald Trump, white evangelicals are essentially afraid, number one, that their country is becoming more diverse racially and ethnically, especially. Most studies have shown that in the next, within a generation, white men and women may be under 50% or a minority in the United States, maybe a couple of generations. So there's this fear of diversity. There's this fear of newcomers into the country. There's this concern that these newcomers, whether they be Hispanics or whether they be Muslims from the Middle East, will not be able to assimilate into American, whatever those happen to be, right? The American way of life. And for many of them, they also fear that a lot of these non-Western immigrants coming into the United States are bringing with them religions that are not Christian. Mm-hmm. So, especially Islam here. So it creates this great fear of Islam, this great fear of racial demographic change with the emergence of Hispanics, especially in the country. They become very, very fearful, and it taps into long-standing fears about a strong African-American voice in the country, especially on questions of, racism and what we saw this summer with the George Floyd, the riots and so forth, and the protests in the wake of the George Floyd death. The world is changing in significant ways, and many white evangelical Christians, who have long connected their understanding of America to both whiteness and Christianity, are worried. They're scared. And maybe we could talk about this later, but throughout American history, whenever these changes take place, you always see some kind of a backlash. You always see some kind of a defense. Right. And sometimes those defenses of a particular white Christian way of life can get ugly. They can maybe even get violent. But certainly they can also be acted out through the support of political candidates who will sort of save them, or be a political strongman who will protect them against the change and try to restore things to the way that they once were. So, this is a particularly, as someone who identifies as an evangelical Christian, this is particularly troubling because it goes against much of what Scripture teaches about how to act in the world, especially as it relates to fear. First of all, it plays into a sort of ugliness that sort of undermines the dignity of all human beings, right?
Mhm.
You know, as an evangelical, I believe that we're created in the image of God and thus have dignity and worth no matter who they are. I think it's particularly disturbing with many of the Hispanic immigrants who are coming into the country who often share evangelical or some kind of Christian faith with the white evangelicals who don't want them here. But I think it's also disturbing simply because as more and more, as demographic change takes place and fear kicks in, many white evangelicals are kind of moving away from scriptural commands to fear not, right? Perfect love casts out fear. Jesus taught us, fear is natural. I mean, fear, we all are afraid. I think fear is a product of the brokenness of this world, right? That there's sin in this world, right? But one is not to dwell in fear. I always quote the Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Marilyn Robinson, who writes a lot about religious themes, who says fear is not a Christian habit of mind. And certainly one does not want to build an entire political philosophy, a particular approach to politics around the idea of fear, because it's only going to lead to paranoia and anxiety and often, I think it's amazingly ironic that on this, you mentioned January 6th, at the Capitol, the day before the Capitol was invaded by these insurrectionists, claiming, some of them claiming the name of Jesus, right? Some of them claiming the name of Trump.
They actually had a prayer in there too.
They had a prayer.
Wow.
They were carrying Confederate flags. But isn't it interesting that on the day before that happened, the state of Georgia, right, one of the bulwarks of the old Confederacy, the South, right, elects its first African American and Jewish senator.
Right.
Right. And you couldn't line that up better for a historian, right? To look at, here's change, right, in Georgia. And then the backlash, again, not directly related, but the backlash then coming to the Capitol the next day. So a lot of things that I think a lot of white evangelicals are very much afraid of right now.
Yeah, I think with that, another thing I think you mentioned in your book relates to change in terms of sexual norms and evangelicals feeling like they're being imposed upon with the various changes and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I think one of the cries that you see among white evangelicals these days is religious liberty. And usually these days when white evangelicals are talking about religious liberty, they are talking about something to do with sexual ethics, whether it be abortion or marriage, right? Or contraception, something to do with that, the protection of women's, the protection of the right of the baby in the womb, and so forth. I've had mixed feelings about all of this. On one sense, I think many white evangelicals, we'll see what happens under Biden, but towards the end of the Obama administration, I think there are many white evangelicals who, for deeply held religious beliefs, upheld the view that marriage is between a man and a woman, right? Again, we won't have time to sort of parse that out theologically or whatever, but many white evangelicals believe that. Many good citizens, they're not necessarily, maybe they didn't even vote for Donald Trump or think Trump's reprehensible or, but they're very concerned that some of their institutions, especially their schools or their colleges that hire, that do not hire homosexuals or get people in gay marriage, might be closed or might be forced to do that. I do think that kind of fear can result in sort of a paranoia and anxiety, and it can be taken to all kinds of levels that are unhealthy. But there is a certain fear there. I do fear that you also hear that many evangelicals are kind of losing their rights, and it's often tied to marriage, right? Our right to believe in traditional marriage is being taken away. And, again, I think, we'll see how this plays out. I don't think this is a major threat to them at the current moment. There are some things that could happen down the road. But on the other hand, I think if it does happen, I don't think evangelicals have been preparing themselves enough for the fact that, they may be persecuted, right? They could be, they could lose that right, or they could lose their religious liberties. And what worries me is there's such a conflation between the nation and the national rights and the church that there's this sense like if they take away a First Amendment right, a tyrant comes in or whatever and takes away a First Amendment right, then that would also be the end of the church, right? Which I think the church has suffered through periods of persecution much worse than losing one's tax exempt status.
Correct.
Again, that would be unfortunate, I think, if that happened. I argue for a much more robust kind of pluralism, in which Christian churches should have the right, and Christian institutions, if they have can prove a deeply held belief, have the right to participate, based upon in society, based upon their religious convictions, even on marriage, without government interference. And I actually know a lot of people who are supportive of gay and lesbian rights who would believe that too. But at the same time, fear becomes this overwhelming thing, and then you're so afraid that this is going to happen that you end up casting your political fortunes with, again, some kind of a political strongman who is going to do more damage to the republic than perhaps these initial fears that you had about your own religious liberty.
Yeah, it's crazy. It is crazy. So one of the things that I learned just going through your book is that fear is not something that just started in the 21st century. This goes way back, combining politics and religion to stoke fear. So one of the things that you noted is in the presidential election between the incumbent John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, fear was used. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, part of the uniqueness, I think, of my book, which is kind of different than a lot of other books about Trump and evangelicals, although there have been some good ones recently. But when my book came out, no one was thinking about this evangelical embrace of Donald Trump and the fear and so forth historically. So I traced some of this all the way back to the 17th and 18th centuries, where you see this long pattern of white evangelical fear. The case you mentioned is the election of 1800, which is really interesting. We're recording this the day before the Biden inauguration, and the peaceful transition of power was a little bit up in the air, maybe not a little bit this year, but a lot of people are invoking the election of 1800 because John Adams, the Federalist, who had been president from 1796 to 1800, actually technically 97 to 1801, gave up power to Thomas Jefferson, a member of a different political party, the Republican Party, or Democratic Republican Party, as it was known. So I know that's not what you asked me about, though. I just thought I'd throw that in there, though, to show like the first peaceful transition of power. But this election was particularly ugly, and religion played a significant role. I often show my classes at Messiah University, some of the quotes from the newspapers during this election, and I say, and then you hear all these politicians today saying this has been the most acrimonious election we've ever had. Both sides played to fear, but especially Adams. Adams represented New England. The Federalists were very, very interested in the role of religion in sustaining the republic, especially Christianity. So what they did was back in 1800, the actual candidates didn't really campaign. It was their surrogates, right? And their newspaper editors and so forth. Every newspaper was a political engine back then. There was no, I always tell my students, you think we have these debates whether like Fox News or MSNBC, liberal or conservative. Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, they look darn right party, mainstream neutral compared to the newspapers of 1800. So each one was lobbying for their own candidate, but the Federalist newspapers really painted Thomas Jefferson out as a man who was going to undermine the Christian fabric of the country. He was an infidel. He was an atheist, they said. And Jefferson was not an Orthodox Christian. He rejected the Trinity, the theological belief in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the God.
Did he have his own Bible too?
He cut out the supernatural parts of the Bible because he didn't believe in anything supernatural. He rejected the belief in the resurrection, right? Didn't believe Jesus was God. All of these kinds of core Orthodox Christian beliefs. So they painted him out as this guy who's not only, can we have an atheist president? Now, technically Jefferson did believe there was a God. He was a creator God who maybe occasionally intervened in the lives of people. But could we have an atheist president in a Christian nation, as they understood it, And once Jefferson got into office, they started saying, like, now that he's in office, Jefferson's going to come after you. Get ready. He's coming into town. He's going to close up your churches. He's going to confiscate your Bibles, or his henchmen, whoever they might be. So you think there was a politics of fear among Christians today. There's a lot of parallels between that election and other elections in American history, but especially that one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it seems like it's almost like people are on the back foot, so to speak, religiously, and they say, well, we fear this may happen, so therefore we need to take this forceful action. It seems like what I've seen a lot. And they also get stoked a lot too.
And like I said, with the religious liberty thing, oftentimes the backlash and them being stoked or them being fired up about their fears often then outweighs the real threat of the original fear. And the thing about fear is, in American history, and I guess generally as well, psychologists tell me too, that fear often is triggered by an idea or a fact that does have some kind of kernel of truth.
Correct.
Right? So, Jefferson did not, embrace Christian, teachings, right? So you build off of that and you create this kind of frenzy. And if you're very good at it, if you're really good at being a fearmonger, in American politics, you could you can go very, very far, even to the presidency. I think, as we saw with Donald Trump.
So yeah, no, that's true. I think in the 4th chapter, you have kind of called it the Court Evangelicals, and you kind of break down 3 streams that make up this group. Can you please kind of share about some of the political objectives and just give some insight into them?
Sure. I coined this term, the Court Evangelicals. It has nothing to do with tennis or anything like that. As I was studying for this book, I realized that in the Renaissance and back in the Renaissance and in the age of monarchy, Middle Ages too, all the kings had courts, right? There were all these people who served the king, who flattered the king, who kind of sat around the king and tended to the king's needs. Every now and then someone would come into the court to entertain the king, or to tell the king how great he was, or the queen how great she was. And I was thinking, as many of these white evangelical advisors, and some of them were black, but there are a couple of black advisors that got out immediately once they saw what was going on. There was others who stuck with him. But once these evangelical advisors began going to the White House on a regular basis, it seemed like they were always going there for sort of photo ops and, to get their picture taken, pray with, public prayers with the Trump. They said they were also advising him on policy. But what I saw was a group of evangelicals who, rather than speaking biblical truth to a corrupt president, they were instead flattering this president, and they wouldn't say a negative word about him. So I use that term not to describe every evangelical who voted for Trump, but those specific evangelical leaders who refused to condemn this man, and in fact, for love of power and fame, decided that they were just going to flatter him so that he would deliver. I think they originally hoped he would deliver Supreme Court justices that they wanted and other policy. And I think that was always a part of the Court Evangelical mindset. But I also think that, I think they liked it, right? They liked being flattered by the president and vice versa. I think the Trump support and the Court Evangelicals kind of represented three main streams of evangelicalism that supported Donald Trump in the election as well. The first one, I think, and I think here of someone like Robert Jeffress, the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, or Jack Graham, the pastor of the huge Prestonwood Baptist Church in Texas, or even Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham. I think of these. Greg Laurie, pastor of a huge church in California associated with the Calvary Chapel movement. These men were traditional, I call them sort of more traditional Christian right politicians. They all came of age in the 1980s when Jerry Falwell Sr., some of your listeners may remember him, and the Moral Majority tried to use politics to reclaim America. Pat Robertson was involved a little bit later on in this, right? They were politicos. They believed that you voted for candidates who had the right views on abortion, the right views on marriage, the right views on stem cell research, religious liberty, whatever the issue happened to be. It was always abortion, but there was always a kind of secondary issue. And they are the kind of people who, it's a largely contractual relationship, right? We want to support this president because he's going to deliver on our end. So again, they've been around for a while, that group. But then there were two other groups that were really attracted to Donald Trump. I mean, one, these two sociologists named, one, I can't remember his first name, Flory and Brad. The second one is Richard Flory and Brad Christensen, wrote a great book and described this second group, the Independent Network Charismatics. And these are this network of charismatic churches. They're not part of traditional Pentecostal denominations like the Assembly of God or the Foursquare Gospel Church, or those kinds of churches, which are sort of long established Pentecostal churches. These Pentecostals or charismatics believe in all of the kind of faith healing and speaking in tongues and prophecy and all of these kinds of things that Pentecostals do. But they surround themselves around strong, powerful leaders who they call prophets. And these prophets are people who kind of give prophecies, right? And several of them, one of the more prominent ones is a man named Lance Wallnau, who picked up his Bible, and God told him to turn to Isaiah 45. And as he read Isaiah 45, he realized that Donald Trump was going to be, God gave him a word that Donald Trump was going to be the 45th president. And as he read Isaiah 45, he realized that there was a comparison between Donald Trump and the Old Testament King Cyrus, who was the Persian king who released the Israelites from their captivity and let them go back to the promised land. And of course, the prophets then, Lance Wallnau and others ran with this, right? Trump is the new King Cyrus. Like King Cyrus released the Israelites to go back to the promised land, Trump is releasing the church from the bondage of the Obama administration, right? Or the liberals, or something like this. And you had all kinds of other prophecies by these that carry a great deal of weight. The independent network charismatics are one of the fastest growing religious movements in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people listen to these prophets, and many of them believe that Donald Trump was a new King Cyrus, an agent of God appointed just for this moment to restore America to its Christian roots. Now, again, the difference between the first group of traditional Christian right politicians is that most of Jeffress and Franklin Graham would probably reject the whole idea of prophecy and that Trump was Cyrus and so forth. And then the third group, which there's some overlap between the independent network charismatics and this group, I think this group's best represented by someone like Paula White, who was one of Trump's closest advisors. I would call these the prosperity gospel. And many of these evangelicals were very attracted to Donald Trump because he was successful. He was wealthy. He lived a sort of a glamorous life. And many of these Pentecostal prosperity gospel preachers would say, wealth is a sign of God's blessing, right? The gospel teaches that if you are, Joel Osteen, some of you may have seen him on TV. He did not come out strongly in support of Trump, but it's a similar message, right? If you're faithful to God, God will bless you with health and prosperity. So I think that's what drew them. So I think you have these three strains of evangelicals coming together for different reasons, but all converging on these kind of moral issues like abortion and religious liberty and, these things that Trump said he was going to deliver.
That's amazing. I think that isn't the independent network charismatics kind of got their basis with C. Peter Wagner?
Yeah, that's really getting down into the weeds. But yeah, I mean, so there's two. From what I understand, there's kind of two movements that are often overlap, and they're very similar. C. Peter Wagner, who was I think he was a missiologist or a theologian at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is a pretty mainstream evangelical seminary. It's not associated with Pentecostalism or charismatic, although a lot of Pentecostals and charismatics from the more traditional denominations have gone there. But Wagner started a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. And pretty much it was very similar to the way I just described the independent network charismatics. The only difference, if there is a difference between the two movements, is Wagner believed that, God speaks to us today, that there are prophets and so forth. And those prophets, would one day kind of usher in with their prophecies, they would usher in the coming, a new great awakening, a new revival, right? That would get men and women saved and prepare them for eternity and usher in eventually the second coming of Jesus Christ. The independent network charismatics believe that too, but I think if I read Flory and Christensen correctly, the independent network charismatics tend to lean a little bit more towards the prosperity angle of it as well. There's more overlap with the prosperity gospel. So the independent network charismatics would also say, we want to have this huge revival, right? And Trump's going to lead this huge revival. Wagner was very cautious about tying his revival into politics, but he was also very cautious about turning this into some kind of pursuit of material wealth as well, while the independent charismatics seem to be a little bit more interested in the wealth aspect of it, some of them at least. But there's a lot of overlap between the movements. And in fact, there are many commentators who actually use independent network charismatics and New Apostolic Reformation, the two movements, synonymously.
Wow. we'll have to delve into that maybe another day.
Yeah,
So I know you
that's pretty
mentioned
crazy stuff. I mean, that gets really down into the weeds. Yeah.
yeah, wow. I know you mentioned Robert Jeffress, the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas. And I think that to help us understand the various, how religious nationalism works, I think a study of Jeffress is very crucial.
Yeah.
So can you share a little bit about like how his views changed over time, which I think is instructive. I know you've debated him, I think in 2016 or so. And then second question to that is in my opinion, the misinterpretation of Romans 13, and how, hey, we just need a strong man who's going to do those things mentioned in Romans 13, discipline people. And so we want the strongest person. So can you, and that led to things like leaving people like Mike Huckabee aside, leaving people like Ben Carson and Jeb Bush, even though they were kind of like, in a sense, ideal candidates from a Christian point of view, but not the strong man. So kind of a lot of stuff there. Can you maybe address some of those things?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Jeffress is, a really interesting character. He, most of for me, Robert Jeffress represents the fundamental change that took place with evangelical leaders on questions of presidential character. And what I mean by that is, if you go back and look at the way white evangelical leaders responded to Bill Clinton in the late 1990s, when he had his sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky and then lied about it, almost to a man, and most of them were men, almost to a man, they condemned Bill Clinton. They said he does not have the character to be president. Maybe the economy is doing well, which it was at the time, right? Maybe he, has certain political gifts, but a man who does not have character, who would cheat on his wife, right? Who would, and of course, Clinton was known for a bunch of other kind of sexual escapades that, whether they happened or not, he was charged with, a lot of them, or they called him out on it. We cannot have a man who lies and a man who lacks sort of this kind of fidelity, right, to his wife in the White House. And for them, many of them argued that this was one of the reasons to impeach him and then remove him from office. They all wrote op-eds and give speeches about how Clinton must be removed. Robert Jeffress was a little too young back then. He was not part of this group. But he did begin writing books after, in the early 2000s, in which he would argue for the character of a leader, right? You cannot vote for a immoral leader. Leaders must be people of morality and character. I think one of the striking things about Trump to me is, for so long, those on the Christian right always saw policy and character, conjoined, right? You vote for a candidate who has the right policies, especially on abortion, the Supreme Court, and so forth. But that person has, whatever your listeners think about the Republican candidates since like Reagan, the Bush father and son, or even the ones that lost, John McCain, Mitt Romney, right? Whatever you think about them, most white evangelicals believed that they were men of character, right? Again, we can debate whether they were or not, but most white evangelicals believed that they were, and they were going to carry out the policies that white evangelicals wanted. With Trump, you have someone who has the policies, but not the character. I think most white evangelicals would say, Trump is a seriously flawed person, was a seriously flawed person. But yet, the question was, with the character issue and the policies are split like they were with Trump, which one would win? Right? Would they reject the man on character? Would they, and it's clear that the policies meant everything, right? Even if the man had no character. Robert Jeffress was a classic example of this, because as a man who's written about the character of office holders, he completely looked the other way at Trump's immorality and moral flaws as a candidate and as a president, I would argue, in the way he talked to people and tweeted at people and demonized people and so forth, because he was delivering on the policies. This gets then into your sort of second part of your question. One of the reasons why he was able to do this, Jeffress was able to do this, was he began to push a view of the passage in Romans 13, which says that Christians are to submit to government. And he began to kind of tease out a political system, a political philosophy, which Martin Luther actually and his followers referred to as kind of a two kingdoms philosophy, in which there was the church and there was the state. And the state's responsibility was simply to protect liberty, right? Protect individuals, right? They didn't have to be a pastor in chief, right? Or the president didn't have to be a moral person or anything. As long as the president was, upholding the law, upholding liberty, protecting the rights of people. And for him, of course, it was the right to worship. And for him, of course, it was the right to protect the unborn in the womb, right? As long as the president was doing this, then he didn't have to be a man of character, which completely changed from how he used to talk about, presidential character like 15, 20 years ago. And of course, a lot of it had to do with his love for Donald Trump, because again, this gets back to that point about the strong man. I mentioned it earlier. You mentioned it in your question, right? People like Robert Jeffress represent these people who are deeply afraid that America is no longer going to be a Christian nation as they understand it. And they saw Donald Trump. I think it was, I'm going to get the exact quote. I used to have this memorized, Otoma, but it was something like, I don't care if the person's a Christian or not, Jeffress said, I just want the best darn son of a gun or something like that. He said, that's going to fight for my rights. And, I think my argument is, even though there were other legitimate Christian right candidates in 2016, and you mentioned some of them, Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio even, right? None of them had that kind of fight in them that people like Robert Jeffress and others liked. They knew that Trump would fight like heck, right? For their rights and their liberties. And I think he was able to do that and convince white evangelicals more than any of those other candidates that he had the platform and the power to be able to do that. And I think that's what it came down to. So again, fear, still very much driving this. Nostalgia too, right? This longing for a golden age, make America great again, right? Let's bring back when we were a Christian nation again, right? Of course, make America great again is a very problematic statement if you're not a white middle-class male. Most Americans of color do not want to go back. Right. They don't want to, America was never particularly great for them in the way that it was for sort of many white men.
All right, we're coming a little bit to a close here. Just two more questions. So sure. The second last one is, how does an understanding of the Immigration and Nationality Acts of 1965, which is a Hart-Cellers Act, help provide insight into the fears that white evangelicals had of strangers coming to America and undermining what they consider their Christian nation?
Yeah, I think this gets out what I said earlier in the podcast. Most people, when they think about white evangelicals getting upset with the way the country is going, they talk about prayer in public schools or Bible reading in public schools. They talk about government interfering in religion as they understand it, or they talk about Roe v. Wade, right? They talk about marriage. But I think what oftentimes we miss is that in 1965, Congress, again, the Hart-Cellers Act, it was known as the Immigration Act of 1965, under President Lyndon Johnson, opened the door doors of America, of immigration, to non-Western nations, Middle East, Asia, Africa. And you don't really see the results of this immigration in America until the 70s, right? It's going to take a while for the bill to pass, but the Hart-Celler Act fundamentally changes the demographic makeup of the United States. Again, you see large numbers of especially Asian, African, and Middle Eastern immigrants. And of course, many of these are Christians who come, but a lot of them are also bringing their own non-Christian religions into the country. Again, I mentioned Islam being probably the most significant player in all of this. This is gonna change the culture. This is going to change the demographic makeup of the culture. And whenever there is profound social change in American history, whether it be Jefferson taking over from Adams, whether it be Catholics pouring into the country in the 1840s and 50s, whether it be intellectual threats like evolution or so forth, there's always going to be this backlash. So I think much of the rise of the Christian right in the 1980s and 90s, but then also the turn towards Donald Trump in the last 4 years is a result of this fear stemming from the Hart-Celler Act. It's an important turning point in this story that sometimes we often miss.
So I think before that, if I remember correctly, I think you said in your book that it was actually tilted the other way. So there were a whole lot more people coming from, I think, Western Europe, I want to say.
Yeah.
So it was tilted that you're having more Europeans coming in. So it was kind of like it was okay for a lot of individuals in the United States. Then it switched, like you said.
Yeah, the problem wasn't necessarily immigration as much as the problem was who was coming, right?
Right.
So after 1924, in 1924, the United States sort of closed the door to a lot of immigration. We don't really have illegal immigration as we hear that term today until after 1924, because prior to 1924, when my grandparents came over from Italy and Slovakia, like they just came, there was no illegal or legal. You just showed up, right? And you were there. If you were healthy, you made it through Ellis Island, you were part of, you're part of America. There was, they weren't hunting you down for your papers, right?
Mm-hmm.
After 1924, there becomes a more structured immigration system, and there were quotas. And the only people who were given quotas to come were Western Europeans for the most part. The Immigration Act lifts and the rest of those nations, Africa, Middle East, and Asia, were banned largely, except for maybe extreme cases like if they had family or something like that. But it was very difficult. 1965 changes all of that. It kind of opens the doors to those groups. It was part of Lyndon Johnson's kind of democratic, sort of progressive reforms, in the 1960s.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. As we wrap it up, the last chapter of your book, I think you bring some hope. So a lot of this is like.
I hope so. This has been depressing.
You're a historian,
I know. Well, I know. This is all I do is live in depression, right?
Yeah, but you got to tie it together. You know what I mean?
Oh,
So,
I know.
So in the last chapter, you contrast Donald Trump to Martin Luther King Jr. just in terms of like their outlook, and obviously hope versus fear on the one hand. The second part was his history, a correct understanding of history versus nostalgia. And the last one was humility versus worldly power. Yeah. And I found the insights in that chapter very, very helpful. Good. Just in terms of the mindset that really Christians should have. Because, I think since last summer and definitely through January 6th, I understand like all the history in a sense. I mean, there's more to know, but like what should I be doing? How should I be thinking about these things? So I think that was very helpful. Can you elaborate on those hope, history, and humility?
Well, it's funny, just a quick preface here. When I wrote the book, I initially did not have that final chapter, and I gave a lecture at a Christian college, and I just, someone asked me, like, I laid it all out, right? Here are the reasons why evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. And then someone in the audience, the first question was from a student, so what do we do now?
Exactly.
I said, I don't know. I'm a historian. I just tell you what happened, right? And then my editor was in the audience. Yeah. And he came up to me and said, at the end, he said, no, he goes, I can't let you get away with that answer again. You have to think about something, how, people are longing for this. And I thought, I'm not a preacher by nature, right? So I'm not necessarily always comfortable kind of being very prescriptive, right? Well, then go do this and go forth, right? And, so I thought, is there some way that I could use my training as a historian to illustrate, something that, a model for Christian citizenship, if you will, that, or Christian politics that was not, sort of Trumpism in nature. And that's where my experience on a civil rights bus tour came in. I had this immersion experience. Messiah University sends staff members, a certain number of staff members every year on a civil rights bus tour, because we're deeply committed to racial reconciliation at the college. And I drew the straw one year and got to go. And I think it was 2017, maybe the summer of 2017. So Trump had been in office for maybe 6 months. So just as I traveled through the South, and we hit every spot, Birmingham, Atlanta, King's, Martin Luther King's headquarters and church, Selma, Nashville, Memphis, you name it, we were there. I began to sort of couldn't help but see the comparisons between the hope-filled politics. And again, we're actually recording this a day after Martin Luther King Day, right? As well, 2021. I could not see, right, the contrast between this politics of hope that the leader, and we met members of the civil rights, we met the veterans, as they say, of the movement, and talked with them and asked them questions, and just the sense of hope, right? I think the last president, Barack Obama, he offered us a certain degree of hope. But this, for many of them, this was a sort of sense of something deeper than just kind of this vague kind of optimism, or, things are going to get better soon, right? We got to trust, we got to have hope. This was deeply rooted in Christian faith, right? This was, maybe there'll be suffering now, and maybe we'll never overcome that suffering now, but maybe God's calling us to suffer at this moment so that there could, future generations could have a breakthrough. But one day we will all experience God's kingdom of justice and peace and love. And, I think Martin Luther King exemplified that message. And then I'm seeing someone like Donald Trump kind of playing upon the politics of fear, right, instead of hope, right? American carnage, he said at his only inauguration. I'm the only one who can save you. Put your hope in me, right? I alone, can fix it, as he said. Then the second thing, as you mentioned, was this idea of power. And, I think many conservative evangelicals are trying to accomplish their kingdom goals, right? The goals of the church through politics and political power. By, if we can just get the seat of power, the Court Evangelicals say, we can make change, right? When to me, the gospel is certainly, as a Christian, the gospel is a gospel that sort of inverts that, right? We find our source of strength from a crucified Savior who died on a cross, right? Who did not, he said, my kingdom is not of this world. He was tempted, in Matthew 4, right? He's tempted, and Satan in the third temptation says, I give you all the power of the world if you'll just bow down and worship me, right? And, Jesus didn't say, okay, I'll take that power if you give me 3 Supreme Court justices. It's crazy, no, he rejects it, right? So I thought something, but then I looked at the civil rights movement, which I think is a deeply Christian movement in a lot of ways. And, these men and women who had no power whatsoever in the world, but yet had this sort of grassroots, um, resistance to power. They spoke truth to power. They were members of a kingdom that was not of this world. That they were driven by justice, right? Christian justice. And then real quick, third, this politics of nostalgia that Trump dabbled in, right? Make America great again, like we talked about earlier, right? Let's go back to the way it used to be. Well, that's fine if you're white, if you're a male, but most Americans, the poor, the people of color, women, Native American, they don't want to go back, right? They want a better future for themselves. They want the ideals of the American founding to be consistently applied across the board, like, that promissory note that Martin Luther King Jr. often talked about. And when I went and read and listened to the leaders of the civil rights movement, they understood American history, right? They weren't, running away from it. They were wanting to reclaim the ideals of liberty and freedom and justice that were there at the founding, but had never been consistently applied to them. And they understood what the founders believed, even with their flaws as slaveholders, the founders were. So we can't ignore all of that. But it was the ideals that Martin Luther King and others often appealed to. Rather than saying, well, we're a Christian nation, or we need to get back to America as a Christian nation. The civil rights movement did some the leaders of the civil rights movement did some really, really good American history. And I think one of the things I try to do as a historian is to get my students and my audiences to look at the past in all its fullness and its complexity, and come face to face with where we messed up, right? We can't go forward without looking backward first and saying, like, reconciliation begins by renouncing what we were before. It's like this whole thing with right now, where you hear all of these people saying, we just want unity again, right? Trump, we need to heal the wounds, well, Trump put this country through some really bad stuff in the last 4 years. You don't just paper over that, right? You have to confront that before you move forward. It's like after the Civil War, I always say, Abraham Lincoln gave this famous address, right? Second inaugural address, in which he says, let's bind up the wounds and heal the nation. Most people forget, though, that he gave that speech after the Confederacy was just about defeated, right? Now we move forward, right? And in order to understand how to move forward, you have to see, well, this happened in the past, even if it was the immediate past. We need to reconcile with that and then move forward. I think that's the role of the historian in society, to be that conscience. And I think this leaders of the civil rights movement understood that.
So I guess I do have one last question. It's, I think, a quick one, though.
Yeah.
How do you feel right now as a historian? Are you hopeful? Are you?
Yeah.
Where would you say you're at? I guess I'm one of those students in your classroom raising my hand and saying.
right. Well, first of all, I'll start with like a sort of joke about that, because I get asked that a lot. And this is not really mine. I'm stealing this from John Meacham, who is a
Yes.
noted presidential historian. Actually, if my CNN report was correct today, he's probably locked up in a room somewhere helping Joe Biden put the finishing touches on his inaugural address, since he's one of his speechwriters now. But anyways, John Meacham said famously that, like, in the Trump era, for an American historian, every day is like Christmas. Because there's always something to say about how this guy is screwing up history, and you need us, right, to do that. So we've had a lot of work in the last 4 years. Some of us need a break, but I know that's not really what you're asking me. Excuse me. As a historian, I think you learn, and we joked about this a little earlier. You learn, if there's one thing you learn, it's about the kind of flawed nature of human beings, right? You know that on this side of eternity, human beings are not perfect, and they're not going to create perfect systems, whether they be government and so forth. So it's really, really hard for historians to get too upset, right? Because they know this is coming, right? It's also, you need to be careful about being too optimistic that, these utopian, like, now that Biden's in, everything's going to be okay, right? So we kind of take a sort of measured approach to this. Now, if you ask me how I feel as a human being or as a Christian, since I know this is a Christian podcast, I think the church has a lot of work to do. I don't think we can just assume that just because now Trump is out, everything will go back to normal. I talk to a lot of pastors and lay people, church people, whose congregations have been ripped apart by politics in the last 4 years, and also by race, by COVID, right? Which I think Trump has something to do with both of those things as well. That's a whole other podcast. There's a lot of brokenness in the church right now. I mean, even on the level of friendship and people who don't trust the other person because of their political persuasions or what they thought about Donald Trump. The Church of Jesus Christ right now is very fractured, and we can't just pretend like now that Trump is gone that those fractures are just going to disappear. I hear a lot of people calling for some type of a revival or an awakening, and most of those people who I see doing that are confusing like an American awakening with an awakening in the church, right? We need an American. I think this is a big thing about Q, right? They want to know a great awakening of American values. Well, I think that's, I could say some stuff about that, but I think the church, really needs to pray for some kind of a healing revival, right? Where and also come to grips with the fact of where we went wrong over the last 4 years and what we let slide in the church in terms of race, in terms of the fight over individual rights, like about wearing a mask or not, the kind of bowl of porridge, or what is it? Bowl pot? What was Jacob? The pottage? Pottage, yeah, that we ate when we got into bed with Trump. I think this has done great damage, and I'm always hopeful. I need to always be hopeful as a Christian, right? That God is working in the lives and hearts of His believers, but again, there's work that needs to be done. So yeah, I think that would be that's where I'm at right now. Yeah.
Well, I definitely appreciate your book. I listened to it a number of times over and over, trying to piece it together and understand the flow of it and the different nuance. It just was really, really good.
Good.
And I'm sure it's a compilation of all the books behind you and everything that you've listened to and read. So Dan, thank you so much for your time. Maybe I'll see, depending on schedule and so forth, maybe have you back in a year and just kind of see how things are going, with the country as an update. And definitely we need, more historians. I think probably now more than ever, and more of the last chapters too, because any advice or any input you can give us is definitely helpful. So I think a takeaway for me is hope and not fear. Humility. I take that as looking at myself to be the best Christian I can be, as far as living out the Sermon on the Mount and not trying to impose myself on others as like worldly power. And then a right understanding of history and where I fit in that history, and not having a nostalgia and wanting to go back to the past. So
good. Well, I appreciate you having me on, Otoma.
Yep. Well, thanks again so much for your time. Okay. If you enjoyed the episode, definitely please click like and subscribe for some more great episodes. Thank you.